Okay. Um, Dana, can you hear? Okay. This is where we were at the end last time. We were finishing up Mayer's account of subspecies. And in a minute, well, a few minutes, we'll see if we can apply this idea to humans. But before I do that, I want to explain to you the slightly more technical version of this that Spencer discusses, in order that you should have a real sort of technical grasp of how someone might actually apply this idea to a group of animals in a species that, for classification purposes, might be treated as a subspecies. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But the sort of new technical idea that Spencer explains is this idea of an analysis of molecular variance. I wouldn't focus too much on the technicalities here, but because the idea is pretty simple, I think. You analyze the genomes of a sample of members of a species, making sure you have a good representation of all the local populations. So you look through the whole range of the species and you sample a random set of organisms over the whole range of the species. So that gives you a measure of the total variation among individuals in the overall population, which is called, for reasons I don't know, sigma 2c. Then you measure the range of variation in each local population. So you've got a measure of variance, the statistical variation in the whole population. Now you measure statistical variation in subpopulations. And then you aggregate all the local populations into groups and look at the range of variation across the groups. And that gives you sigma to A. And the total genetic variance in the species, variation in the species, is just the sum of these three numbers. So, in the example that Spencer gives, which comes from work on our cousins, the chimpanzees, the biologists measure genetic variation among African chimps, which are distributed in groups more or less like this. So there's these are bonobos, which are currently not classified with chimpanzees, so we're going to leave those out. These are the Upper Guinea. This is the Guinea coast, so these are the Upper Guinea chimps. There's a gap here where there aren't any chimps, probably because of human behavior. Guinea chimps. Then here, this is the Niger River, this is Nigeria. We have a second population of Gulf of Guinea chimp. So that's an Upper Guinea chimp. This is a Gulf of Guinea chimp. And finally, you look at the population of equatorial chimps. Speaking for myself, I wouldn't be able to tell that these came from different populations, but those are in fact examples of animals from each of those three distinct or geographically definable populations. So now, remember, we have to calculate the variance among individuals. So we sample the total population, most variance of that. Then we sample the local variance, and then we sample the variance within those those big groups, right? And that gives us sigma 2a and b and c. Now, so they did that in a study whose name I'll give you in a minute. The results showed that nearly 2/3, so 0.64, 0.66 would be 2/3, so nearly 2/3 of the variance was between individuals. So most of the variety across the whole range is between individuals. That means it's sort of represented in each of the populations. There's a lot of individual variation, in other words, as a proportion of the total variation. The second number is the amount of variance within local populations. That's quite a small amount of the variance. So you're looking at small groups, and not surprisingly, the variance within those is a small proportion of the total thing. Then you look at the proportion of the variance that comes from, sorry, that should be 0.3 of them. That comes from when you look at these three kinds of chimpanzees, and that's 1/3 of the variance. So 1/3 of the variation in the genetic molecular variations in these animals is associated with moving from one group, the Upper Guinea chimps, to the Guinea Coast chimps, to the Central African chimps. All right. And because this number, sorry, I say this is 0.3, correct it in your mind, because it has to add up to 1. Because this is greater than 1/4, 0.25, they say that it's reasonable to treat those three populations as subspecies, right? Because enough of the variance is due to being in one of these populations or other, that the populations are statistically different enough that it's worth keeping track of for classification purposes. And so these three kinds of chimp are not just classified as distinct because they have different ranges. They're classified as distinct because they have different, they have significantly different distributions of molecular variance. All right, so this is the paper, and the same paper argues that the evidence supports the view that the Guinea population is significantly different genetically from the others, sharing a last common ancestor with the populations in Upper Guinea 500,000 years ago, 0.46 million years ago, and with Equatorial Africa 1/3 of a million years ago, 320,000 years ago, right? So the idea is that the ancestry group separated quite a long time ago. In one case, 500,000, in another case, 1/3 of a million years ago. All right, clear enough. Yes? All right. So now you want to know, reasonably enough, what happens if you do this sort of thing with humans? That's up, but we're not here to talk about it. So once more, if you want to know what the closest common ancestor is of human beings, that is the last person who's an ancestor of every living human being, that person lived probably less than 200,000 years ago. And almost, in fact, we know, in Africa somewhere. So, and I'll in a minute, I'll talk more about the sigma A, B, and C for humans. But that means that the closest common ancestor of all humans is closer in time to us than the closest ancestor of the Guinea and Central African chimps. So this paper is effectively using this notion to view these subspecies as separating, so they might eventually become distinct species. Right now, there is small gene flow between these populations. And if you take a chimp from any of these populations, if you take a male from any of these populations, you can breed it with a female in all the other populations. There's no barrier to gene flow, it's just that they're geographically separated. But the thought is, the Darwinian thought is, well, once that started happening, eventually, if to the extent that genetic isolation persists, there will be changes in the genes of these populations because there'll be mutations, and also there'll be selection pressure. The Upper Guinea chimps, all these chimps live in forests, but the Central African forests are different in their ecological character from the West African forests, and so there are different selection pressures, different diseases around, and so on. And so eventually, in the long run, maybe these chimps would separate off from one another and become different species, just as the way our ancestors separated from Australopithecus millions of years ago in southern Africa. So the implicit in Mayer's account and in this more technical implementation of it is the idea that if these chimps were to survive, then they might eventually become distinct species, separated now not just by space, but by the inability to breed together. And so it's in some sense a biological fact that they're tending in that direction. Now, of course, unfortunately, it's pretty unlikely that that'll happen, because unfortunately, chimps will probably cease to exist before that happens, because we are destroying all sorts of species on this planet. But the thought is, were they to persist, and absent some change, significant change, such as a big pressure from predators pushing the Central African chimps towards the Guinea chimps, in which case they would start interbreeding again. Absent something like that, they're sort of tending towards separation. Now, Spencer considers a couple of objections to the way this AMOVA technique is used to deal with the chimps. One is, I said, well, because it's greater than 0.25, the interpopulation variance, they're separate species. But why 0.25? That number just came out of nowhere, right? It's a quarter, but why not 0.23 or 0.26, 0.3? So one objection is just that number is arbitrary. And it is arbitrary. Nobody's suggesting that there's a biological reason for picking 0.25, some deep biological reason. But, as I said, if you think of the idea of a subspecies as being a species, as they say in the all new Latin, in the process of becoming, then you'll say, well, it would be absurd to insist on any particular point. What's happening is a process, and we picked a point in the process, but the really important thing isn't whether it's 0.25 or 0.3. The point is it's up from where it was when they were all one population, and the variance was spread among them all. So I don't think I agree with Spencer, that isn't much of an objection. And in fact, you could try another way of doing this. You could say, are there significant biologically significant features of the differences between populations? Here's one. It doesn't apply to chimps, but it does apply in some cases. And it picks up on a proposal that I think I've mentioned to you before when I reflected on the history of the word mulatto. Did I reflect with you on the history of the word mulatto? Perhaps not. All right. So the word mulatto used to be used to refer to people who had one black and one white parent. I remember being called a mulatto when I was a child. Now I think it's thought to be rude. I don't know why. I mean, I don't know why mulatto is worse than interracial, but somehow it is. And why was this word used? You know, right? It's because of something I did mention, which is that mules are the infertile offspring of black and white, horses and donkeys. right? So the idea, of course, behind this was, well, yes, you can cross Africans and Europeans, but if you do, the products will be infertile, right? Like, and so that's why mules aren't a species. They're just animals produced by the meeting of two species. It's because mules can't reproduce. They can't produce more mules. They're, as I said before, they're biological dead end. Now, of course, this is not true. You have met little Eric. Eric is a refutation of the claim that Africans and Europeans can't have descendants because his great grandparents were one African and one European. But the reason why people use that word is because they wanted to think that even though black and white people could have children, that didn't mean blacks and whites were really one species. Because though they could have children, but as I say, that was false. So that was a bad argument for the conclusion because the premise wasn't true, but it explains why they used that word and what they were thinking. All right. So now that would be a very biologically significant fact, right? That members of these two subpopulations, when they come together, can reproduce, but they can't, their descendants can't reproduce. Reproduction is the process by which life goes on. So of course, it's central to biology. Now, this isn't true of humans, and it isn't true of chimps either, so it doesn't apply in this case. But that would be an example of a reason for treating two populations as distinct, even if they could interbreed. Right? That would be a biologically significant reason. I'm not saying it applies in this case, but I'm saying it shows that there could be a biologically significant reason, a non-arbitrary reason, a reason different from just picking 0.25 because it seems like a big enough number. All right, so Spencer thinks there's a more substantial objection to the subspecies concept defined by Mayer's notion, implemented by techniques like analysis of molecular variance. And that is, and I'll spend some time on this objection, that that a biological subspecies defined either by Amova or by the more general Mayer idea, which we began with today and ended with last time, is not what he calls a genealogical group. So now we need to understand what he means by that. So a genealogical group is a group of organisms. So, well, there are two kinds of genealogical. One is so-called monophyletic or a clade, and there's a branch of classification biology now called cladistics that studies clades, which is a group of organisms with a common ancestor. So we humans are a clade because 200,000 years ago there was a person who was the but we have the closest male ancestor and closest female ancestor. Actually, one was longer ago than the other. I can't remember whether, as it were, whether Adam was earlier than Eve or Eve was earlier than Adam. But anyway, we are descendants of biological Eve, and we are all descendants of biological Adam. They didn't have sex with each other, but that doesn't matter. And so we are a clade. Every human being has a common ancestor. But there is another kind of genealogical group, which is not monophyletic, but paraphyletic, which consists of groups of people who have a common ancestor. But there are other clades, other monophyletic groups that are descendants of that ancestor who are not members of the group. So to give a not very interesting example, I just said all human beings are clades. They're all descendants. We all have common ancestors. Take out of humanity all the descendants of my grandfather. Now we've got a group that consists of people, every member of the group is descended from a common ancestor, but not every descendant of that ancestor is in the group, because my grandfather was a descendant of the human being you had in common. So if you were making the group monophyletic, you would add my grandfather descendants back in. Right? Now, that's a stupid example, but there are real examples, and I'll give you one in a minute, of paraphyletic groups. But let me first explain to you why geographical races of humans aren't either mono or paraphyletic groups. Strictly speaking, the ancestor could be an individual or a species, but I'm going to just consider the case where it's individuals. I mean, that's how the thing is defined. But I don't want to go into that complication because it doesn't make any difference to the arguments I want to make. So a clade consists of not just the ancestor, but all of the descendants in between, obviously. So, as I say, human beings have that common ancestor 200,000 years ago, and every one of his or her descendants is and has been a member of the species Homo sapiens. So we are a clade or a monophyletic group. And you can see that if all current organisms are classified into clades, then there will be a tree of life, with every species going back to a common ancestor, and each common ancestor belonging to a clade that goes back, and so on. In a paraphyletic group, everyone is a descendant of a common ancestor, as in a monophyletic group, but there are other monophyletic groups, other clades, that are descendants of the ancestor who aren't members of the group. And paraphyletic groups can be fitted on a tree too. Here's one that is currently believed by many classification biologists. This is a classification of vertebrates. So we're in here, mammals, there are amphibians, fish, there are testudo, does anybody know what testudo? I think you can guess what those are, crocodiles and alligators and so on. And these are ancient beasts. All of these are what we call reptiles. Right. Now, this is a monophyletic group because all of these groups are descended from here. Right? But the reptiles don't include all the descendants from there because it leaves out the birds, who are also descended from here. Right? So this is reptiles are not a monophyletic group, they're a paraphyletic group because for our own reasons, we've decided we'll keep birds separate from the rest of that descendant. So there is a monophyletic group that consists of reptiles and birds, but we don't have a name for it in our language. And you know, I don't know what the history is of why they sense it done this way, but that's how they're done. So reptile, we don't treat birds as reptiles, but of those of you who were fans of dinosaurs when you were kids, which is probably a lot of you, will remember that birds descend from Archaeopteryx, who was a dinosaur who could fly. All right. So there's an example of a paraphyletic group, namely the reptiles. Real live example. Mammals, on the other hand, are monophyletic. The amphibians are monophyletic, and the fish are monophyletic. That is, all the fish have a common ancestor, and every creature that's descended from that common ancestor is a fish. Sorry, these are lizards. So now, okay, so why isn't a geographical race a genealogical group in the way that reptiles or mammals are? Reptiles being an example of a paraphyletic group and mammals being an example of a monophyletic group. Well, the chimpanzees provide an example. They fall into 3 subspecies, or geographical races, if you like. But the paper that Spencer cites shows that there's been extensive interbreeding among the ancestors of all 3 groups. So a typical chimpanzee in each group shares a lot of recent ancestry with typical members of the same group, even though the groups are indeed currently distinguishable in their gene distributions, but they also share a lot of recent dish ancestry with members of other groups, members of the other groups. So the Upper Guinea chimps share recent-ish ancestry with Lower Guinea chimps, and same for Lower Guinea chimps and the chimps of the Central African forests. And in fact, though, chimps show more difference from each other in genetic characteristics, that 0.3, than some chimps show from bonobos, who are not classified as chimpanzees at all, because some of the chimpanzees, Central African chimpanzees, are close enough to the bonobos that they have recent ancestry in common with them, even though they're not even members of the same species. So, so that's why, so that means that these subpopulations aren't clades. They're neither mono or paraphyletic groups. And the point is the same thing's true about humans. Because human beings didn't spread out into the world from Africa. So this is a current guess about this. So closest common ancestor lived up here somewhere, European island or somewhere like that. 100,000 years ago, some of them went off to form the West African human populations, and some went down. I mean, there were humans here all along. I mean, also of our ancestral species, but we're looking at it as our common ancestors, descendants. At about the same time, a group sets off, and 50,000 years later, they're forming the populations of South Pacific. And there's this group goes that way. There's a group that goes up here, and they go into here and form European populations and Asian populations. About 1,000 years ago. All right. Now, you might say, well, that looks like, I mean, every descendant, and then of course, over there, 15,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, people disagree about this. They crossed here and started forming the ancestors of all the, what we call Indians, or the indigenous populations of the Americas, have been here for 15, 20,000 years. All right. Now, this looks like you could tell a monophyletic story about people right here. Everybody from here on is descended from that person, so that's a mono. And you know, so on. But that's wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, because of things like this. People tend to think nowadays, well, it used to be true, and then in 1492, Europeans started traveling anymore, and then stopped being true. That's a very Eurocentric story. I mean, Admiral Cheng Ho also went to Africa in the Ming period from China. But the point is, there have been lots of things like that. This is the explosion out of Arabia that happened with the rise of Islam, which is why there are Arabs all along here. They're descended from people who live here. Then all over the place. These are the Huns. From Attila the Hun. Yeah, if you bring armies over here, you bring genes, right? And so these people who are descended from, to a significant degree, from people whose ancestors 60,000 years ago traveled over northern Eurasia to become the ancestors of Chinese and Japanese and so on, those people have come back now. Now they're mixing with people who are descended from people who were here, people who were here, and people who were here. So it's not the case that what you get in the end is a set of these populations are not. It's not just, they're not just not monophyletic because of the European expansion started in the 15th century. They're non-monophyletic because that's what things been going on along. Another example, Alexander the Great, whom I think I mentioned too, because Aristophanes is Tudor. He starts out here as a Greek in Macedonia. Of course, now Macedonia was Macedonia then. And he went all the way over to here. So he got as far as I believe the Indus River. So he got as far as something that's now in India. And if you look at they didn't just leave that. There were a lot of them, thousands and thousands of soldiers. He had an army of about 30,000. And what do soldiers do when they travel across territory? They drop genes, Genes, not GANs. So those two things might be connected. So we have here not just, and of course we have biological, therefore traces of the Macedonian expansion. We also have a bunch of Greco-Buddhist cultures here. And I don't know, one of my favorite kinds of sculpture is Gandhara sculpture. And Gandhara sculpture is Afghan sculpture that looks like Greek sculpture. And it's fabulous. And so there were several Greco-Buddhist cultures. So it didn't just leave biological traces, it left cultural traces, which you can still see, putting up Gandhara sculptures. Unfortunately, since they're not supposed to do that, but that's another problem. All right. So we are not, these subpopulations, you might argue that because there is some number of interpopulational variance, I'll discuss how much it is in a minute, that these are subspecies. But if they are subspecies, they are not monophyletic, they're not clades, right? That is, none of them consists of people who have common ancestry with everybody in the group, and nobody outside of the group has an ancestor, right? Except the whole species. That's the only group of humans of which that's true. I mean, I'm talking about these large subpopulations. Again, obviously, my grandfather and his descendants are a monophyletic group, but we wouldn't normally think of them as a race. I suppose we call them a race of Cripses, since his name is Crips. But all right. Okay, clear enough? All right, so the most obvious example of all this, of course, isn't, I mean, in America, in the Americas, isn't ones I gave, it's the 18th century movement of 11 million people from Africa to the New World in the slave trade. And they started coming in the early 18th century in significant numbers, rose to its height in the mid 18th century, and the last enslaved people brought to the New World were probably brought in the 60s or so, long after the North Atlantic trade had been banned by the British. And the British didn't just ban it, they stationed ships off here looking for slave ships, and if they found them, they captured them, took the enslaved people off them, and put them in Freetown and told them find their own way home. But they didn't allow them to come to the New World. All right. So 11 million people bring a lot of genes at a time when that was a pretty large proportion of the human species. It's gotten much bigger since then. But... All right. So now, and that's just one of the big modern migrations. Europeans came to the New World starting in the 15th century in huge numbers too. And currently, a majority of the population of North America is descended from Europeans. 500 years ago, there was zero. 500, 600 years ago, there was zero, right? So that's another big migration. And again, what does that mean? Genes flowing. But that's not the only one. Similar things true of Australia and New Zealand, right? till the 18th century, only people in New Zealand were Maori. And the only people in Australia were what we call Aboriginals. Those people whose ancestors arrived in that part of the world about 60,000 years ago and then started spreading out from there. There's huge migrations of Chinese people into Southeast Asia, into the Americas, lots of Chinese, Jamaicans, and Brazilians, and that's what they call them. Again, people move, genes move. So there are lots of, and of course, there's a famous other example, which gives us our word for some of these connected groups of people of common descent. Diaspora, namely Jews who left the Middle East after the destruction of the temple and after the end of the Roman period. Many of them went off and they went to Spain, they went to North Africa, they went into Europe, they went all the way east, ancient Jewish communities in China. And again, people flow, genes flow. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, I mean, for our purposes, it's intrinsically interesting, I grant you. Because it means that human races can't be genealogical groups. They're not clades, they're not paraphyletic groups. And the scientists working in systematics aim, this is Spencer's argument, to get back to his argument now, the people working in science systematics aim to classify organisms in ways that reflect biological processes. And as Spencer points out, this was one of Darwin's central ideas. So biologists, sorry, that's the peopling of the Americas. So biologists want their classification to pick out groups of organisms that in some sense nature has produced. And because they think that nature produces groups by evolution, largely through natural selection, Darwin was roughly right, they think that the only groups nature could have produced are genealogical. So, to revert to a point I made earlier in the course, if you're deferring to biologists to tell you whether there are races, then you're going to have to accept that they're only serious about genealogical groups, which is why that classification of the vertebrates is cladistic, right? All those groups are either monophyletic or paraphyletic groups. So if that's your thought, if the central theoretical idea of modern biology is the theory of evolution, then human biological variation doesn't divide us into a small number of genealogical groups because of all this, right? And so, whatever we think about these subclassifications of humans, we shouldn't think of them, if that's your central theoretical idea, as biological. Now, however, we are philosophers. So we're allowed to disagree with biologists about biology, even if we think we have a better argument than they do. And so we could challenge this central presumption. After all, if that were right, then since the chimps aren't genealogical groups, right? You saw that. They're not mono or paraphyletic. I mean, the individual subpopulations aren't. Since that's true, and since nevertheless these biologists have classified them as separate subspecies, it follows that it's just not true that biologists may pretend that they only care about genealogical groups, but here they are in a biology journal classifying chimps in a way that isn't genealogical. After all, and furthermore, the reason those chimp populations are different in the ways they are has a biological explanation, right? Namely, they're relatively reproductively isolated and living in different environments, and so they've been subjected to different selection pressures, and also they are samples of an original population, that's a bit random. So in some subpopulations, you'll get what geneticists and people who study these called founder effects, because it may just have turned out, for example, that among the people who set off, humans who set off 100,000 years ago into Arabia, they had an especially high concentration frequency of some genera. I mean, there's only two possibilities, right? Either they had the same frequency of that gene as the whole population of Africa, or they had a different one. Well, and so sometimes it's going to be the same, sometimes it's going to be different. So there'll be differences in the population that are just the result of random things, right? But founder effects are biological. I mean, in the only sensible, well, in one of many sensible senses of the word biological, there are things that biologists can study. And selection is something that biologists can study. So why can't we say that just as it's reasonable to sub-classify the chimps into the 3 subspecies, why couldn't we say, despite the fact that human races aren't genealogical groups, why shouldn't we nevertheless do the same as we do with chimps? So after all, while biologists don't aim to predict patterns of migration, right? That's not part of what biologists typically study. They understand that migration produces these kinds of effects. And so they take migration as one of the things that they have to look into when they're trying to understand the current distribution of genes in animal populations. And so the fact that humans, migration is, we're not as spectacular, I suppose, as some of those bird species, like the Canadian geese who pollute my pond with their waste, but spend their winters in Canada. I'm sorry, their summers in Canada. That's one of the waste of me. But we're pretty. I mean, because they migrate annually, and humans typically don't do that. I mean, there are humans who do that. The Bedouin used to do that. They used to travel around and surface with oases. That's their own life. And there are other migratory human groups following. There are people who follow there are hunters who follow the migrations of the animals that they hunt, for example, and so on. And that was true in North America, some of the Native American populations. All right, so the fact that the explanation for the migrations in humans is human activity, warfare, trade, and lots of economic migration, people going to places where they have a better chance of making money or feeding their families. The fact that that's what explains it, which is not biological, doesn't mean it doesn't have biological consequences. It obviously does. One reason that there are a lot of sickle cell genes and other thalassemias, other diseases that are associated with non-standard forms of hemoglobin, carries oxygen in your red blood cells. One reason there's a lot of those in the US gene pool is because people with these genes came through the United States through the Middle Passage, the slave trade, and from places like Nigeria, where malaria is endemic and there's selection pressure for hemoglobin S, which is the version of hemoglobin that produces sickling cells. That's why it's a biological fact, I suppose, that gene is well represented in the American population. And that's the explanation. That isn't the total explanation, because malaria isn't just found in Africa, and some Eastern Mediterranean people, some Greeks and Turks, have sickle cell for the same reason, or some other thalassemias for the same reason. And so that's why their non-standard hemoglobins are represented in our population. All right. So having the kind of geographical racial classification could help us understand things. For example, something that is interesting, I think, from a theoretical point of view, not just a biological point of view, but a theoretical point of view that would include biology, which is what are the different roles of migration, and adaptation, and selection in the shaping of gene pools? That's an interesting question. All right. But look, even if we think that migration is not a biological process and therefore isn't to be studied by biologists particularly, you might think there was nevertheless no reason to limit your reasons for studying the statistical distribution of human variation to biological explanations of the statistical distribution of human variation, right? You know, there are lots of things. I mean, we're an interesting species. There are lots of things to be said about us. And some of the interesting things about our gene pools, local gene pools, and the total human gene pool are the results of history, not of biological process, but of historical processes. And in fact, the study of ancient DNA turns out that if you human beings have been collecting bones for a very long time. Turns out that we now have good enough microchemistry that we can recover DNA from those dry some. We can recover DNA. So now, and if we've got enough of them, we can look at populations of DNA in the ancient world, and we can use those features of those populations to uncover the processes of human migration, which are interesting not for biological reasons, they're just interesting. I mean, isn't it interesting to know, for example, that there was a population in the British Isles 10,000 years ago of humans, and that none of their descendants are there today. All the modern population of the British Isles comes from those. That's interesting. If you don't find it interesting, you lack a historical measurements. David Reef, who works on these things, I forget whether he's at MIT or Harvard, but he lives in Cambridge somewhere, has had beautiful maps based on, he goes around the world collecting ancient bones, removing the DNA from them, and using that to study how people moved around the world over the last 100,000 years. It's absolutely fascinating. All right. So, at any rate, because modern systematics tends to favor genealogical groups, and notice a species is a genealogical group, I mean, at least in a sexually reproducing animal, we can't apply these ideas very easily to non-sexually reproducing animals, but that doesn't matter because we are a sexually reproducing animal. And because geographical races are humans, but also, as it turns out, in chimpanzees and birds are not genealogical groups. We saw that for chimps, but same is true for birds. We won't be able to turn to, so for example, in our garden in New Jersey, we have two kinds of chickadee. And they're, well, I think one's called the Carolina chickadee, and I forget what the other one is called. But they interbreed at their margins. So they're not genealogical groups. So we won't be able to turn to biologists to get the classification of them if biologists are interested in genealogical groups, but we could use tools from biology, as David Reef has. It's not Reef. Right. Anyway, begins with R. We can use biological tools to study history of human migration, even though the biologists aren't terribly interested in the results. I mean, they're interested as humans, not as biologists. All right. Sorry, this is just underlining the point that the reason why there are a lot of non-standard hemoglobins in North America is because people came from all these places. I mean, they're different thalassemias. All right. Question. We just went through an argument of Spencer's. The argument was that biologists aren't interested in these non-genealogical. And suppose that's true for the moment. Is that a reason? Is that a reason for rejecting the idea that geographical races are biological groups? What's presupposed by this argument? What's presupposed by it is the idea it's not a feature of the groups really that makes them biological, right? It's a question of whether biologists have to have a reason to be interested in it. Is there a theoretical reason why biologists should care about it? Right? I mean, care about them in a way that makes them central to thinking about human biology. And this is an argument that they won't care about them. But what's now, I think this is a good argument in the sense that if the premises are true, the conclusion is, but are the premises true, or don't we have reason to doubt them?
I guess this is more just a general question, but what about like medical predispositions to things like people being predisposed to melanoma or certain?
Yes, good. Talk about that in just a minute, but that's a great question. I just want to easier. So let me just say, look, I think the main difficulty was this. I gave you a paper from a biological journal about the classification of chimps that doesn't meet this condition. Right? So these biologists were interested in it. So why do we say that they're not interested in it? What's the basis for saying that? I think that part of the reason is that is actually that Spencer's Spencer's an expert. He has a degree in cladistics, and people in cladistics are very interested in genealogical groups for obvious theoretical reasons. But there's lots of biology, which I'll come to you in a minute. All right. Whether or not, so moving on to the next part of the argument, whether or not the view that only geological groups are produced by biological processes correct, and I think I'm not sure that it is correct, but you know, he has a master's in classification biology and I don't, so maybe I should defer to him. But whether or not that's correct, Spencer thinks that that's why modern biologists aren't very interested in human subspecies. It's because they aren't genealogical groups in this sense. And so attempts to construct biological accounts of the reality of races have turned elsewhere in recent years. And Spencer gives 3 recent proposals. This is one. Races or subspecies are the smallest population unit that function as an evolutionary lineage within a species. To explain that, I'd have to explain a lot more evolutionary theory than I have the time for, so I'll just say that we're interested in that. That's the work of a guy called Templeton, and you can look him up. Cladistic species or cladistic races are monophyletic groups in well-defined species, and there are, of course, monophyletic groups in the human species. I told you about one earlier. Grandfather is a monophyletic group. So there are at least some monophyletic groups. It's quite hard to get monophyletic groups that are much bigger than that, actually. But you can find some. There are probably Amerindian tribes up the Amazon, which are monophyletic. Trace their ancestors, could trace their ancestors. They may even be able to tell you who their ancestor was, for all I know. And because they're pretty isolated, they don't breed much with neighboring populations. Maybe some of them are monophyletic, I don't know, but that's not. You don't typically think of race, when you think of races, we're typically talking about large subpopulations of the human population, not tiny ones, like 2,000 Amerindians. Anyway, that's the cladistic view. And then there's another view, which is that races are inbred lineages within a species that originated from populations once geographically separated, and that as a result of the separation, there are different superficial phenotypic traits, and the distinct phenotypes are maintained when conspecifics from different inbred lineages are brought together due to incipient isolating mechanisms, all these are technical terms, that developed during the period of geographical isolation. That's a fancy schmancy way of saying, look, in humans, yes, we're all descended from common ancestors in Africa, but some populations have been isolated from others for a very long time. One of the things that has happened in that period of isolation is that they have been features of these visible, easily visible features of them have been selected for, which distinguish them, like skin color, right? Or sort of shape of eyes, types of hair. These are things that it's easy to see, right? So that these populations, once geographically separated, different phenotypic traits, and then his point is that when these groups from these different ancestries come together, they can share territory without sharing genes, right? Because there are incipient isolating mechanisms, that is, mechanisms that make gene flow between these two populations, even though they're sharing the same geography, that make gene flow rates very low between, right? Racism did that in Americas, right? Racism meant, especially, well, the details don't matter really. Racism meant that the rate of gene flow between populations of African and European descended people were quite low in North America. So low that, as Kitcher points out, Kitcher was the guy who wrote this. If you look at the rates of intermarriage, taking that as a rough measure of interbreeding among blacks and whites in North America in the 1960s, the rates of gene flow between those two populations were so low that if it were lizards, you would say they were separate species or subspecies. Okay? So there was an isolating mechanism. It was not a biological isolating mechanism, it was a cultural isolating mechanism, which kept gene flow between two populations together. Right? And so that's basically the case that Kitcher is thinking about. That as a result, dark skin remained relatively concentrated in percent groups rather than just, and light skin also, rather than the two just moving independently of percent. Because there were, right until 1968, there were laws in the United States against intermarriage between blacks and whites, right? Supreme Court only declared anti-miscegenation so-called laws unconstitutional in 1968. So before that, and it was a Virginia case, and the family were called the Lovings. So Mr. and Mrs. Loving, out of love, presumably, married one another, and the Attorney General of the state of Virginia took him to court and said, "You're breaking our law," and eventually the Supreme Court said, you can't do that, Virginia. So as you say, in Loving v. Virginia, but that's 1968. You may think that's a long time ago, but I was 14. So I don't think that's a very long time ago. So there were all these mechanisms separating, stopping. This was a cultural phenomenon, but it had a biological effect. It stopped gene flow between two overlapping human populations. Right? Now, notice that that didn't last very long, that success of anti-miscegenation. During slavery times, there was quite a lot of miscegenation because people like Thomas Jefferson had sex with their slaves. Thomas Jefferson and his father-in-law, because the slave he had sex with, his father-in-law, actually was the half-sister of his wife, who was married dead. No adultery, just extramarital sex. All right, So, and even if you thought that there'd been no defo between people descended from Africa and people descended from Europe and the Americas from the colonial period to 1970s, you won't be surprised to know that there's lots of such things now, and so much more than there was, and so and that period, from the colonial period to now, is a long time in American history, but a short time in the history of the species, and a very short time for evolution. Not enough generations to accumulate a lot of interesting biological effects. So, anyway, that's Kitcher's suggestion that maybe for a period there were races in America because of the isolating mechanisms of racism. Right. Okay. I'm just sort of going through all these cases. I haven't time to discuss in more detail, all of them. I want to focus on the last of the ones he mentions. No, the penultimate one, which is in the work of Andreasen, which is the cladistic view. So her view is that there were once monophyletic human races, roughly the ones, that's her. I'd like you to be able to imagine the people we're talking about, whose views we're talking about. And she thinks that roughly the human races were these. This comes from a very famous book from 20, 30 years ago, maybe more, around, oh gosh, 60 years ago, by, I mean, this is the 1994 edition, but he's to this book before that. In a book by Luca Cavalli-Sforza, there he is, called The History and Geography of Human Beings. Now, he did all this before modern genomics. He did it by collecting measures of the frequency of genetic variation in human populations by just collecting accounts of what alleles, like hemoglobin S as opposed to other hemoglobins, were in human populations. And then he used fancy schmancy algorithms to infer the history of how those things got to be distributed the way they were. And so I should say, by the way, that Cavalli-Sforza did not approve of talk of races. He did not think these were races, because he thought that from a biological point of view, there were lots of ways of classifying human beings, and none had any, depending on what you were doing, which one you should use. There was no favorite, there's no best way. It depended on what you were up to. And so he was against using this stuff to talk about races. But that didn't stop people. People want to talk about races, they will. The fact that the guy told them not to doesn't stop them. And so people interpreted this cladistic looking family tree as reasons for thinking that there were these races. So these, we're to imagine, and maybe our question is, we're to imagine that these are clades, like the reptiles and the amphibians and the mammals and so on, right? So this is a clade. Northeast Asians, Arctic Asians, Amerindians, Europeans, and non-European Caucasians. Right? That's one clade. Another clade is basically Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It's an African clade, but there's also a European and non-European Caucasoid clade. That means because light-skinned people in Europe spread over into Asia, Eurasia, Central Asia. So that's what non-European Caucasoids is about. Similarly, we've got Japanese, Chinese, Inuit, and then North American, and so on, right? So now this was based on very clever work using what was available at the time to reconstruct this growth chart. Now, So this picture suggests, as I said, the cladistic picture of the vertebrates that we saw earlier. And Kobolis-Sforza did his work before modern genomics, which allowed the direct recording of the genomes of many human beings. So he worked just with data sets of the distribution of a variety of alleles, for which there was data at the time. Now, the first thing to notice about these 9 groups is what? What's the most obvious thing about this if we're talking about human race? Good, Africa stands by itself, but then, so, but what's another thing about this end?
Southeast Asian and Northeast Asian.
Good. So that's surprising to some people, probably. And that's because, so what is that an instance of? That's an instance of the fact that this classification doesn't correspond to anything that people normally think about when you ask them about human races, except the distinction between Africans and everybody else. Right? This stuff, people don't normally think of, you know, the Lao and the Cambodians and the Vietnamese as a race, distinct from all the other people around them. All right. So one thing about this list is that if it's the right list, we need to revise our thinking about what the races are. We still have Africans. That's not surprising. Why is it not surprising? Because these are the descendants of the ancestral population from which all these others did in fact split off. Right? But go to Northeast Africa. What's the most obvious thing about Northeast Africa? It's that genes are crossing into and out of Africa all the time. Go to Tangier, Casablanca. That's in Africa. Again, what's the most obvious thing? Well, genes have been crossing the Mediterranean, crossing the Straits of Gibraltar. If you can swim, it's not very far. It's technically a barrier, but I mean, I couldn't swim it, but there are humans who could, apparently. And of course, that's how Spain came to be under the Arabs, the Moors, for so long, under the Arab and Berber people. It's because they took armies across there and conquered. Just to this day. All right. So so as you said, I forgot who said this, the one class category that does fit with our things is Africans, right? Because we think when I say Africans to you, you think of Black people, right? Probably, but Muhammad Gaddafi was an African. St. Augustine was an African, right? Born in Hippo in North Africa. That's right, born in Benghazi, he was Bishop of Hippo. King of Morocco is an African, but he's not very dark skinned. The Ethiopians are African and they're brown rather than black, some of them. So it's an interesting question, how to interpret that in human terms. Does it mean, as people often say, well, I mean Black Africans, but which of those? Because what happens in human populations isn't that there's a line on the map and everybody below the map is one line is one color and everybody on the other side is another. There's a gradual increase or decrease, increase in melanin, decrease in melanin. And so, as I said, all around the world, people who live close to the equator over the long haul tend to be dark skinned than people who live in the far north or the far south. But it's not like there's a line where suddenly you look over the line and you see all these people a different color from you. So where are we going to draw the line? All right. So the first thing to say about this, as I said, is that it's not really, if these are the races, that's news to most of us. The second thing to say is what I've been saying all along, which is that more recent studies based on the analysis of whole genomes, which we can now do, we can take the genome of a single person now and map every gene if we want to. And we've done that for lots of people from all over the world. And analysis of that sort makes it very unlikely that any of these groups is in fact monophyletic. Is a claim, right? Which is Andreassen's claim. So she's claiming there were clades, then Columbus messed it all up, right? Columbus and Magellan and all those guys messed it. But there's reason to think that isn't true. There may no longer be a small set of human racial categories that cover most people, but she thinks there were once such groups, and that Cavalli-Sforza's family tree confirms that. As I've said, I think there are reasons to doubt that, not just reasons grounded in the current genomic analysis, but reasons grounded in the fact that we know that human beings do that thing that I said the Arabs and the Huns and the Chinese and Jews, and a whole bunch of other people, Africans coming to the New World have done, which is move around, not just since 1492, but all along. After all, if that hadn't happened, there wouldn't be anybody in Latin America. There would be no indigenous population in Latin America. They got there 10,000 years ago. They came slowly by a very long route. They came up through over Alaska and down. So that's why, of course, they're closely related to Northeast Asians. That came from Northeast Asia 15,000 years ago. Most of them. But now, those people are a minority of the population of the Americas, right? So the Americas are no longer populated by Amerindians. Most of the Amerindians are in North America, but they're swamped by lots of people from lots of other places. So, and of course, not only did this migration happen in the past, but as I say, there's been lots of such migration since. People just don't say totally separate cultural and biological groups over the long haul. They're constantly mixing and matching. Why does this matter? Well, it means that human races aren't geological groups, they're not clades, they're not paraphyletic groups, and the scientists working in systematics aim to classify organisms in ways that reflect biological processes. And indeed, as I've said over and over again, this is one of Darwin's central ideas. So biologists want their classifications to pick out groups of organisms that nature has produced, and because they think that nature produces groups by evolution, partly by natural selection, though there are other mechanisms, they think that the only groups nature could produce are genealogical. So if you're going to defer to biologists, that's what you should think. Now, so the first thing to say about this statistic stuff is that there are races here that no one's ever identified as such, normally. They aren't the groups we normally think about. And second is, they lack one important condition that, again, is part of a lot of normal thinking about races, which is that you can tell them roughly apart by looking, that they're phenotypically distinct. That was implicit in what Kitcher said, right? He said, you've got these groups, they've evolved over long periods separately, they come together. When they come together, they are phenotypically different, and they maintain phenotypic difference by not interbreeding, even though they're in the same population. Again, that presupposes that what we care about in these classifications has something to do with visible phenomenology. All right, I will stop there for now. And next time I'll talk about Spencer's objections to Andreassen. And I hope that by the end next time, I will be catching up and we'll start talking about sociology. But we'll see. Thank you. Thank you.
Have you noticed like this lecture of today?
Yes.
I think it's like mainly talking about biological differences,
Yes.
biological knowledge.
Yes.
I was just wondering, would that also will be part of the exam or something? Because it's related to biological knowledge and stuff like.
So